he makes an argument for the deity of the Holy Spirit. And he says, and I'm going to read this line out loud. If God was to be maintained in his incommunicable attributes, and Lane, you just mentioned the absolute immutability of God, the triune God. If God was to be maintained in the incommunicable attributes, the Spirit of God, not man, had to affect the salvation of man. Okay, in and around that statement, he's making a twofold argument. Number one, the Holy Spirit must be a member of the ontological Trinity. The absoluteness of his work follows on the absoluteness of his person. And then second, this entails that man does not determine the final outcome of his eternal destiny. He is totally at the behest of the sovereignty of God when it comes to his own salvation. Now, we can deal with both of those in turn. Let's just talk first about the absoluteness of the Holy Spirit. Work out for us how Van Til is making this argument from the application of redemption by the Spirit to the deity of the Spirit.
Yeah, in Van Til's language there on page 34, salvation is, quote, a work of God alone. And one of the reasons why this has to be the case, and this is going to start moving toward the work of the Spirit, toward the deity of the Spirit, is that Van Til affirms what we would call an Augustinian or Calvinistic, more basically, biblical notion of sin as total depravity and utter inability to do what pleases God. So he says, as he's putting this in context, that the problem that man has with regard to salvation is that he is wholly incapable of seeking or pleasing God in and of himself, and is dead in sins and trespasses. Now, unlike Rome, who says that man lost only supernatural gifts of grace in the fall, but his nature remains fundamentally intact and good in itself. We could quote Bellarmine here, but we won't. Van Til insists that the whole man is enslaved to sin and dead in sin. Unlike the remonstrant Arminian, who says that sin weakens man's free agency, Van Til's insisting that fallen man is utterly incapable in himself to prepare himself to salvation or cooperate with the non-saving preparatory grace of God. So given the depravity of man, Van Til insists in good old-fashioned Augustinian and Calvinistic, more basically biblical terms, that salvation cannot be a work of man, but must, by contrast, be a work of God alone. Now, if that's the case, and if it's the Spirit who, 1 Corinthians 1:9, calls believers into the fellowship of Christ, if it's the Spirit who sovereignly imparts life to dead sinners, Ephesians 2:1-5, if it's the Spirit who raises the valley of dry bones and causes flesh and sinew to cover and breathes the breath of life into them, then Van Til is saying there must be a monergism where one is at work. And if salvation is from God alone, and if salvation is applied by the Spirit, then Van Til's reasoning is that the Spirit must be fully and entirely God, a distinct person from the Father and the Son. But if God saves sinners and man has no capacity to save himself or prepare himself for it, then the very fact that salvation is of God and the Spirit applies that salvation, the Spirit himself must be the absolute, self-contained third person of the ontological Trinity. That's the quickest way I know to try to get at some of the basic reasoning here.